I'm Madison, and 3 days ago, I became a millionaire overnight when my great-aunt Catherine passed away, leaving me her entire $3.2 million estate, including her sprawling Georgian mansion and her chain of luxury boutiques. I was still processing the shock when they appeared at my doorstep, like ghosts from a nightmare I thought I'd buried forever. My biological parents, the same two people who vanished from my life without a trace when I was 14 now, standing in my foyer with practiced smiles and open arms, acting as if 15 years of abandonment could be erased with a simple, "Hello, sweetheart." But what they didn't know was that Aunt Catherine had prepared for this exact moment, and the lawyer's briefcase sitting on my kitchen counter contained revelations that would shatter their carefully rehearsed reunion into 1,000 pieces. The memory of that Tuesday morning when my world first collapsed still haunts me with crystalline clarity. I woke up in our cramped 2-bedroom apartment in suburban Denver, in silence so profound it felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the building. Mom hadn't knocked on my door for school, which was unusual since she was obsessively punctual about my education. Dad's coffee mug wasn't in the sink, and his work boots weren't by the front door, where he always left them in a perfectly aligned row. Their bedroom door stood wide open, revealing empty dresser drawers pulled out like accusatory tongues. The closet gaped hollow, with only a few forgotten hangers swaying slightly in the morning breeze. From the window they'd left cracked open. On the kitchen counter, weighted down by a salt shaker, lay a single sheet of notebook paper, torn from one of my school supplies. The handwriting was Mom's careful cursive, the same script that had signed countless permission slips and birthday cards. "Madison, we can't do this anymore. Your great-aunt Catherine will take care of you now. We're sorry for everything. Don't try to find us." 23 words that dismantled 14 years of what I thought was a loving family. I read it 17 times, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something that made sense, something that didn't mean I was utterly alone in the world. My father, David Richardson, had worked as a regional sales manager for a medical equipment company, bringing home decent money that should have been enough for our modest lifestyle. But I later discovered he'd been steadily draining our savings account, feeding a gambling addiction that had started innocently with office fantasy football leagues and escalated into high-stakes poker games in back rooms of Denver bars. The final straw came when he borrowed against our apartment lease and lost everything in a single weekend trip to Las Vegas. My mother, Jennifer Richardson, had been a part-time bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, meticulous with other people's money, while remaining willfully blind to her husband's financial destruction. In the months before they disappeared, she'd developed what I now recognize as severe depression, spending entire weekends in bed with blackout curtains drawn, emerging only to heat up frozen dinners and remind me to keep my voice down because her head hurt. The signs had been escalating for months, but at 14, I interpreted them as normal adult stress, the hushed arguments that stopped abruptly when I entered a room, the way Dad's hands shook slightly when he opened bills at the kitchen table, how Mom started buying generic everything and rationing my school supplies, like we were preparing for some invisible siege. I spent 3 days alone in that apartment, surviving on cereal and crackers, too terrified to tell anyone what had happened. What if they put me in foster care? What if my parents came back and found me gone? I'd heard horror stories about kids who disappeared into the system, shuffled between uncaring strangers until they aged out with nothing but a garbage bag of belongings and a profound distrust of anyone who claimed to care about them. On the fourth day, Mrs. Patterson from next door knocked on our door concerned because she hadn't seen my parents' car in the parking lot and had heard me crying through the thin walls. When I finally opened the door, disheveled and hollow-eyed, she immediately called the school counselor, who contacted Child Protective Services. The social worker, a kind woman named Linda Martinez, with gentle eyes and a voice like warm honey, spent hours making phone calls from our kitchen table, while I sat on the couch, clutching my stuffed elephant, a childhood comfort I hadn't touched in years, but suddenly needed desperately. Through the fragments of conversation I overheard, I learned that tracking down my great-aunt Catherine would be complicated since my parents had maintained minimal contact with extended family. Catherine Elena Morrison lived in Savannah, Georgia, a city that might as well have been on another planet from everything I'd known in Colorado. She was my father's aunt, his mother's older sister, a woman I'd met exactly twice during brief, awkward holiday visits when I was much younger. She'd never married, never had children, and had built a successful business empire from a single vintage clothing shop into a chain of upscale boutiques throughout the Southeast. When Linda finally reached her by phone, I could hear only one side of the conversation, but Catherine's voice was crisp and authoritative, even through the receiver. There was a long pause after Linda explained the situation, and I held my breath, wondering if this stranger would simply hang up and leave me to whatever fate awaited unclaimed children. "Tomorrow morning," Catherine said finally, her words clear enough for me to catch from across the room. "I'll drive up tonight and we'll handle the legal arrangements immediately." She arrived at dawn in a pristine black Mercedes that looked like it belonged in a different economic bracket than our apartment complex. Catherine Morrison was 72 years old, but carried herself with the bearing of someone who had never questioned her right to command any room she entered. Her silver hair was styled in an elegant bob, and she wore a tailored navy suit with pearls that probably cost more than our monthly rent. "You must be Madison," she said, extending a firm handshake rather than the hug I both craved and dreaded. Her eyes, the same dark brown as my father's, assessed me with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to making quick decisions about people and situations. The legal process of establishing guardianship was bewildering and exhausting. Court appearances, interviews with judges who spoke in incomprehensible legal terminology, psychological evaluations designed to determine my mental state and Catherine's fitness as a guardian. Through it all, Catherine remained unflappable, hiring expensive attorneys and navigating bureaucracy with the same systematic approach she applied to running her business empire. My parents never appeared at any hearing. The court made extensive efforts to locate them for the formal termination of parental rights, but David and Jennifer Richardson had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. Their cell phones were disconnected. Their former employers had no forwarding information, and even their old friends claimed ignorance about their whereabouts. The abandonment carved wounds so deep that years of therapy could only partially heal them. I would wake up gasping from dreams where I heard their car pulling into the parking lot, where Mom's voice called my name from the kitchen, where everything had been a terrible misunderstanding that could be resolved with explanations and apologies. For months, I scanned faces in crowds, certain I'd glimpsed Dad's distinctive walk, or Mom's laugh echoing from another aisle in the grocery store. Dr. Patricia Walsh, the therapist Catherine hired, helped me understand that children instinctively blame themselves for parental abandonment because accepting responsibility feels safer than acknowledging our complete powerlessness. If it was your fault, she explained during one of our sessions, then theoretically you could fix it. But the truth is, their decision had nothing to do with your worth as a person, and everything to do with their inability to handle their own problems. Moving from Colorado to Georgia felt like emigrating to another country. Catherine's antebellum mansion sat on 5 acres of meticulously maintained grounds in Savannah's historic district, surrounded by century-old live oaks draped in Spanish moss. My new bedroom was larger than our entire former living room, with 14-foot ceilings, original hardwood floors, and windows that looked out over formal gardens that required a full-time groundskeeper. The rules in Catherine's household were numerous and non-negotiable. Breakfast at 7:30 sharp, served in the formal dining room with proper place settings and cloth napkins. No shoes on the antique rugs. Piano lessons twice weekly with Mrs. Whitman, who had taught the children of Savannah's elite families for 40 years. Homework completed at the mahogany desk in the library, not sprawled across bed covers or propped against couch cushions. Evening meals required appropriate dress and conversation about current events or educational topics. I tested every boundary during my first few months, perhaps unconsciously hoping to be sent away before I could be abandoned again. I wore muddy sneakers on the Persian carpets, skipped piano practice to watch television, and gave sullen one-word answers during dinner conversations. But Catherine never threatened to send me elsewhere. Instead, each infraction brought logical consequences delivered without anger or disappointment, just matter-of-fact enforcement of household standards. When I was late for breakfast, the kitchen was closed until lunch. When I ignored homework assignments, weekend privileges were suspended until grades improved. When I spoke rudely to Mrs. Whitman, I spent my Saturday morning polishing every piano key with specialized cleaning solution and writing a formal letter of apology. Gradually, I began to recognize that Catherine's rigid structure wasn't meant to control me, but to provide the stability and predictability that had been missing from my life. Her rules applied to herself as well. She maintained the same breakfast schedule, dressed appropriately for every occasion, and never broke commitments or promises, no matter how small. The private academy Catherine enrolled me in Forsyth Preparatory School was an adjustment that required months of academic and social acclimation. My Colorado public school education hadn't prepared me for Latin classes, advanced placement courses, or classmates whose families owned horse farms and beach houses. I struggled initially with the accelerated curriculum, spending long evenings in Catherine's library, surrounded by tutoring books and supplemental materials. Catherine's approach to my educational challenges was characteristically direct. "You're starting behind," she informed me, after reviewing my first semester grades. "But that doesn't mean you have to stay behind. Intelligence isn't fixed, and effort can compensate for most disadvantages. The question is whether you're willing to work harder than your peers to catch up." It wasn't the warm encouragement I craved, but her pragmatic confidence in my abilities proved more motivating than empty reassurances. I hired peer tutors. With my allowance money, formed study groups with classmates and gradually worked my way onto the honor roll by junior year. College applications brought our first major disagreement. I wanted to attend the University of Georgia, where several friends were planning to go, but Catherine pushed for more prestigious institutions. Our argument escalated into the kind of shouting match I'd never dared have with my biological parents, words I immediately regretted but couldn't take back. "I never asked to be your project," I screamed, tears streaming down my face. You can't just redesign my entire life to meet your standards." Catherine's response was delivered in the same level tone she used for business negotiations. "And I never asked to become a guardian to a traumatized teenager," she replied. "But here we are. I'm trying to give you options your parents never provided. You can use them or waste them, but I won't allow you to choose mediocrity because it feels safer." That night, she did something unprecedented. She told me about my father's childhood, filling in pieces of family history I'd never known. David was extraordinarily bright. She said, her voice softer than usual, as we sat in the library after dinner. He could solve complex mathematical equations in his head and had an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. But our family couldn't afford college tuition, and academic scholarships were more competitive then. She explained how Dad had worked at a garage after high school, while Catherine received the family's only educational investment, a partial scholarship to business school that she'd supplemented with loans and part-time work. He resented that disparity for years. She continued. It drove him to seek quick financial solutions, get-rich-quick schemes that ultimately led to the gambling addiction that destroyed your family. This glimpse into my father's background helped me understand Catherine's relentless focus on education as protection against future vulnerability. She wasn't trying to control my life. She was trying to ensure I would never face the limited options that had derailed my parents' stability. I applied to 8 universities and was accepted at 6. Ultimately, I chose Emory University in Atlanta, close enough to visit Catherine occasionally, but far enough to establish my own identity. The tuition was substantial, but Catherine paid without complaint, viewing it as an investment in family legacy rather than an expense. College provided the first real freedom I'd experienced since childhood. I joined organizations, made diverse friendships, and discovered aptitudes I'd never explored. My major in business administration, with a marketing focus, seemed to flow naturally from years of observing Catherine's strategic thinking and attention to consumer psychology. Summer internships at Catherine's corporate headquarters gave me hands-on experience in retail management, vendor relations, and financial planning. I learned that her success hadn't been inherited or accidental. It was the result of methodical market research, careful expansion planning, and an intuitive understanding of what affluent customers wanted before they knew it themselves. Our relationship evolved during those college years, the physical distance somehow allowing emotional intimacy to develop gradually. Our weekly phone calls became less formal occasionally, including laughter and shared observations about current events or family stories Catherine had never shared before. When I graduated, magna cum laude, the pride in Catherine's eyes was unmistakable, though she limited her public display of emotion to a firm handshake and a single nod of approval. "Well done," she said simply, but the weight of satisfaction in those 2 words meant more than elaborate celebrations from other families. I returned to Savannah after graduation, accepting a position as marketing director for Morrison Boutiques. Working directly with Catherine required adjustment. We were family, but she expected the same professional standards from me that she demanded from every employee. Our board meetings were conducted with formal protocols, and my ideas were evaluated on merit rather than familial preference. The business relationship strengthened our personal bond in unexpected ways. Catherine began sharing strategic decisions with me, explaining the reasoning behind expansion choices and personnel decisions. I discovered that her success was built on principles of integrity and long-term thinking that extended far beyond profit margins. Customer loyalty isn't purchased with sales, she taught me during one of our strategy sessions. It's earned through consistent quality and authentic service. People can sense when you're trying to manipulate them versus genuinely serving their needs. Then, 2 years ago, everything shifted when Catherine was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The oncologist's prognosis was bleak, 6 to 12 months, with aggressive treatment, possibly less without intervention. Catherine absorbed this information with the same composed focus she brought to quarterly financial reports. "Everyone dies," she said matter-of-factly when I broke down in the hospital corridor after the appointment. "The only variables are timing and how we use whatever time remains." She continued working throughout her treatment, gradually transferring responsibilities to me as her energy diminished. Our roles reversed slowly. I became the one managing her medication schedule, coordinating medical appointments, and ensuring she maintained proper nutrition during chemotherapy cycles. In her final months, a tenderness emerged in Catherine that I'd never witnessed before. One evening, as I helped her into bed, she gripped my hand with surprising strength. For someone so diminished by illness, "You were the daughter I never allowed myself to imagine having," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Taking you in was the most important decision of my life, Madison. I hope you know that." She passed away peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 15 years after my parents had abandoned me on another Tuesday in the same month. The parallel timing felt like cosmic symmetry, one chapter ending precisely when another had begun. The funeral was dignified, but sparsely attended. Catherine had maintained professional relationships rather than close friendships, and most of our extended family consisted of distant cousins scattered across other states. I stood at the graveside, realizing that this woman, who had never spoken of love, had become my true mother through thousands of small acts of commitment and care. Grief struck in unexpected waves. The house echoed with absence. I would find myself saving newspaper articles I thought might interest her, or reaching for the phone to share some minor business triumph before remembering she wouldn't answer. But I continued operating Morrison Boutiques according to her principles, honoring her legacy through consistency rather than sentiment. The letter from Harold Jameson, Catherine's attorney, for over 3 decades, arrived exactly 1 month after the funeral. The will reading was scheduled for the following Friday at 10 in the morning at his downtown Savannah office. The formal language mentioned that all interested parties would be present, which I assumed meant business partners or charitable organizations Catherine might have included in her bequests. Jameson was a distinguished gentleman in his 70s, with carefully combed silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance. His office occupied the entire top floor of a historic building downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Savannah River and walls lined with legal volumes that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in decades. I arrived precisely on time, wearing the same black Chanel suit I'd worn to Catherine's funeral. Jameson greeted me with genuine warmth, expressing condolences once again, before mentioning that we were expecting several other attendees before beginning the formal reading. I settled into one of the leather chairs surrounding his conference table, reviewing quarterly sales reports to keep my mind occupied while we waited. The familiar rhythm of analyzing numbers and market trends provided comfort during this emotionally charged proceeding. The office door opened, and I glanced up, expecting to see one of Catherine's business associates, or perhaps a representative from her preferred charities. Instead, time seemed to fracture and slow as 2 people I had convinced myself I might never see again stepped into the room. My biological parents stood in the doorway, older and more worn than my memories had preserved them, but unmistakably the same two people who had vanished from my life 15 years earlier. My father, David Richardson, had aged dramatically. His once thick brown hair was now sparse and completely gray, and deep lines carved permanent paths from his nose to his mouth. He had gained considerable weight, his formerly athletic frame now soft and shapeless beneath an ill-fitting suit. My mother, Jennifer Richardson, appeared even more transformed. Her blonde hair was cut in a harsh style that emphasized the gaunt angles of her face, and dark circles shadowed her eyes like bruises. She wore a dress that might have been fashionable a decade ago, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse with white-knuckled intensity. "Tswar Madison." My father said, his voice rougher and more gravelly than I remembered. "Look at you, sweetheart. All grown up and beautiful." They moved toward me with hesitant steps, and I found myself rising on unsteady legs, my heart hammering against my ribs so violently I was certain everyone in the room could hear it. My mother reached for an embrace that I couldn't return, standing rigid as her arms encircled me briefly. The scent of her perfume was both familiar and foreign, triggering a flood of memories I'd spent years learning to manage. "We've been trying to find you for so long," my mother said, stepping back to examine me with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my appearance. "You look so sophisticated now, just like your great-aunt Catherine." The casual way she mentioned Catherine's name, as if she'd maintained some connection to our family all these years, made my stomach turn. "How did you know about today?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "We saw Catherine's obituary in the paper," my father explained, attempting what I suppose was meant to be a sympathetic smile. "We've been keeping track of the family from a distance. We knew you were with her, and we thought this might be our chance to reconnect." The implication that they had known my whereabouts all these years, while never attempting contact, hit me like a physical blow. They had chosen to remain absent from my life, and now they stood here, acting as if their appearance was motivated by grief and family obligation rather than financial opportunity. "Please, everyone take your seats," Jameson interjected diplomatically, gesturing toward the chairs arranged around the conference table. "We have one more person joining us before we begin the formal proceedings." An elderly woman I recognized as Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton, Catherine's housekeeper for over 25 years, entered the room with quiet dignity. She had been uniformly kind to me throughout my years in Catherine's household, treating me with maternal warmth that complemented Catherine's more formal affection. She nodded at me sympathetically before taking a seat as far from my parents as the room's arrangement allowed. As we waited for Jameson to begin, my parents attempted conversation that felt surreal and performative. "We live in Phoenix now," my mother offered with forced brightness. "The dry climate is better for your father's arthritis. I manage a small auto parts store," my father added, as if this mundane detail would somehow normalize the situation. "Nothing glamorous, but it provides steady income." I nodded mechanically, unable to formulate coherent responses, while my emotions churned in violent conflict. Anger at their abandonment warred with a treacherous flicker of longing for the parents I'd once loved, while confusion about their motives battled with growing certainty about why they had chosen this moment to reappear. Jameson cleared his throat and opened a thick leather portfolio. "We are here to execute the last will and testament of Catherine Elena Morrison. He began in formal tones. I will summarize the primary provisions before distributing copies to the relevant parties. My parents leaned forward, slightly, an almost imperceptible movement that confirmed my suspicions about their true motivations. They had not come for reconciliation or closure, they had come for money. To my great-niece, Madison Elizabeth Richardson, Jameson read, I leave the entirety of my estate, including but not limited to the property at 1247 Drayton Street, and all its contents, the surrounding 5 acres of grounds, my complete ownership of Morrison Boutiques, valued at approximately $15 million, all bank accounts and investment portfolios, totaling approximately $3.2 million in liquid assets, my personal effects, including jewelry artwork and vehicles, and all intellectual property and business interests related to my commercial ventures. The silence that followed felt dense and charged. I had expected to inherit something substantial, but the scope of Catherine's bequest was staggering. She had built an empire, and she was passing it entirely to me. My father coughed quietly, breaking the tension. Excuse me, Mr. Jameson, but is there anything else, any other provisions we should be aware of? Jameson regarded him coolly over his glasses. There are several smaller bequests to longtime employees, he said, nodding toward Mrs. Thornton, and detailed instructions for annual charitable donations to be made from business profits. But the bulk of the estate transfers to Madison, as I have stated. My mother's smile became strained around the edges. Well, this is quite an overwhelming responsibility for someone so young, she said, reaching across the table to pat my hand in a gesture that felt invasive rather than comforting. Fortunately, as her parents, we're in a position to provide guidance and support. The words, as her parents, after 15 years of complete absence, struck me as grotesquely inappropriate. But before I could respond, my father continued with barely concealed calculation. Legally speaking, he said with forced casualness, since Madison was still a minor when Catherine took her in and there was never any formal termination of our parental rights, we remain her legal guardians. We'd be happy to help manage these substantial assets until Madison gains more experience with financial matters. The panic that flooded through me was immediate and visceral. After 15 years of silence and abandonment, they wanted to control my inheritance, to position themselves as my protectors and advisors, while clearly calculating their own benefit from Catherine's legacy. I believe there may be some confusion about the legal circumstances here, Jameson said calmly, his tone carrying a subtle edge that suggested he had anticipated this exact conversation. Perhaps we should continue this discussion on Monday, when I have all the relevant documentation prepared. Shall we say 2 o'clock? My parents exchanged a quick glance, loaded with meaning, before my father nodded. That would be fine. We're staying at the historic inns downtown. Perhaps we could take Madison to lunch beforehand, catch up properly after all these years. Before I could formulate a response, Jameson stood smoothly. If you'll excuse us, I need a few moments with Madison to discuss some immediate administrative matters related to her new responsibilities. My parents hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave, without securing their position more firmly. We'll see you Monday. Then, sweetheart, my mother said, reaching for another embrace that I couldn't reciprocate. We have so much to talk about, so many years to catch up on. As they collected their coats, my father handed me a business card with their cell phone numbers written on the back in his familiar handwriting. Call any time, he said, with manufactured warmth. Day or night, we have 15 years to make up for. The door had barely closed behind them when I sank back into my chair, hands trembling uncontrollably. "They can't really have any legal claim, can they?" I asked Jameson, my voice barely above a whisper. The attorney's expression was grim but determined. "Prepare yourself for a challenging conversation on Monday," he said. "Your great aunt anticipated this exact scenario, and she made very thorough preparations. I need the weekend to organize all her contingency documentation." Mrs. Thornton approached before leaving, squeezing my shoulder gently with weathered hands that had comforted me through countless childhood disappointments. "Miss Catherine was the wisest woman I ever knew," she said quietly. "Trust that she would never leave you vulnerable or unprotected." That evening, I sat alone in Catherine's study now, my study trying to process the day's revelations, while surrounded by the familiar comfort of her carefully organized files and leather-bound business journals. The house felt different, now charged with possibility and threat in equal measure. My phone rang constantly throughout the evening, my mother calling every hour with messages ranging from excited chatter about our reunion to subtle hints about the responsibilities that came with sudden wealth. I let each call go to voicemail, not yet ready to navigate their emotional manipulation while still reeling from their unexpected reappearance. Despite every instinct warning me against it, I agreed to meet my parents for dinner the following evening. Jameson had advised waiting until our Monday meeting, but a part of me needed answers that only they could provide. I chose Wilk's Dining Room, an upscale restaurant Catherine had favored, for business meals, thinking the public setting would keep the conversation civil. They were already seated when I arrived, my father rising to pull out my chair with exaggerated courtliness that felt performative rather than genuine. My mother had clearly made an effort with her appearance, wearing what looked like a new dress and carefully applied makeup that softened some of the harsh lines the years had carved into her face. "We ordered a bottle of wine," my father announced as I settled into my seat. "That Pinot Grigio your mother always enjoyed. I thought we could toast to family reunions and new beginnings." "I don't drink wine," I replied firmly, requesting water instead. It was a small boundary to establish, but it felt important to make clear that I was not the compliant child they had abandoned. The first 20 minutes were filled with awkward small talk about my education, my work, my life in Savannah. They asked carefully, neutral questions, while I provided minimal answers, studying their faces for glimpses of the parents I had once loved unconditionally. "We owe you an explanation," my mother finally said, reaching across the table for my hand, which I kept firmly wrapped around my water glass. "What we did was unforgivable. We know that. We were in a terrible place, mentally and financially." My father continued his voice, carrying what seemed like genuine remorse. "I had developed a serious gambling problem, and your mother was struggling with severe depression. We convinced ourselves that you would be better off with Catherine. She had resources and stability." My mother added tears welling in her eyes. "We had nothing to offer but chaos and dysfunction. We thought we were making a sacrifice for your benefit." "You had yourselves," I said quietly, the words carrying 15 years of accumulated pain. "That was all I wanted from you." My father looked down at his plate, unable to meet my gaze. "I got help for my addiction," he said. "I've been clean for 9 years now. Your mother found the right medication for her depression. We've built a modest but stable life in Phoenix. We thought about reaching out so many times." My mother insisted, dabbing at her eyes with her napkin. "But we were ashamed of what we'd done. And as more time passed, it became harder to know how to bridge that gap. "You said you knew I was with Catherine," I pointed out. "How exactly did you know that?" They exchanged another meaningful glance before my father answered. "We contacted social services about 6 months after we left," he admitted. "They confirmed you were placed with family and doing well. We checked periodically over the years to make sure you were safe." The revelation that they had made these periodic inquiries while never attempting actual contact felt like another betrayal. They had apparently eased their consciences just enough to move forward with their new lives, while leaving me to believe I had been completely forgotten. "We've regretted our decision every day." My mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "Seeing you now so successful and accomplished, it breaks our hearts that we missed watching you grow up." The waiter delivered our entrees, creating a brief reprieve from the emotional intensity. When he departed, my father carefully shifted the conversation toward more practical matters. "Catherine did extraordinarily well by you," he said, cutting his steak with deliberate precision. "Better than we ever could have managed. And now she's left you set for life. The house alone must be worth $3 million in today's market," my mother added with calculated casualness. "Plus the business. It's an overwhelming amount of responsibility for someone your age." "I've been working in the business for years," I stated flatly. "I understand the operations and responsibilities." "Of course you do," my father said soothingly. "But there's a significant difference between helping to run a business and having complete ownership responsibility. The tax implications alone can be devastating without proper guidance." My mother leaned forward conspiratorially. "Estate taxes can destroy inherited wealth if they're not handled correctly. We've learned a lot about financial management through our struggles." I watched them carefully, noting how they alternated between emotional appeals and financial concerns with practiced ease. The pattern was becoming unmistakably clear. "We could help you navigate these complexities," my father offered. "We've made our mistakes and learned from them. We know all the pitfalls to avoid now." "That's an interesting perspective," I observed, "from someone who abandoned his family because of financial irresponsibility." My father flinched, but recovered quickly. "Those experiences taught me valuable lessons about what not to do. I understand the consequences of poor financial decisions better than most people." My mother reached across the table again. "We're not asking for anything specific," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "We just want to be part of your life again, to help however we can. Though, if you wanted to help your parents get back on their feet financially," my father added, "that would mean the world to us. Our mortgage in Phoenix is about $90,000. Plus the medical bills from your father's arthritis treatment," my mother reminded him. "Another $40,000 would clear those completely." I leaned back in my chair, cold clarity washing over me like ice water. "So, $130,000 would solve your immediate problems," I summarized. They nodded eagerly, apparently missing the calculated tone in my voice. "And what about my problems?" I asked. "The 15 years of wondering what I did wrong. The therapy costs. The nights I spent waiting for phone calls that never came. What's the price tag for healing those wounds?" My mother's tears flowed more freely. "We know money can't fix the emotional damage we caused. We just want a chance to rebuild our relationship, to be a family again." "A family that begins with a financial transaction," I noted. "How exactly does that work?" My father's expression hardened slightly, revealing a glimpse of something less sympathetic beneath his remorseful facade. "You have to understand our position, Madison. Yes, we made terrible mistakes, but Catherine was family too. That fortune originated from family money our grandmother left her the seed capital to start her business, while my mother got nothing. So you feel entitled to it? I asked directly. Not entitled, he backpedaled quickly. Just included. We're your parents, sweetheart. Blood relationships mean something. I thought of Catherine, who had demonstrated, through 15 years of actions, what genuine parental love looked like. Yes, I agreed. Blood means something, but commitment means more. The rest of dinner continued along similar lines, with my parents oscillating between emotional manipulation and financial hints. By dessert, they had casually mentioned several other debts and suggested I might want to add them to the Morrison Boutique's payroll in consulting positions with generous salaries. As we parted outside the restaurant, my mother embraced me tightly, whispering, "Think about what family really means, Madison. Everyone makes mistakes, but we're here now." I drove home through Savannah's historic district in an emotional fog, passing the familiar landmarks that had become my world under Catherine's guidance. The Spanish moss, hanging from ancient oaks, looked like ghostly curtains in my headlights, and the antebellum mansions stood like silent witnesses to secrets and betrayals spanning generations. When I reached Catherine's house, I found a message on the answering machine from an unfamiliar number. "Miss Richardson, this is Carol Martinez. I worked with your parents 15 years ago at First Federal Bank in Denver. I saw their names mentioned in connection with Catherine Morrison's obituary and felt compelled to reach out. Please call me before you make any agreements with them. There are things about their financial situation you should know." Sleep proved impossible that night. I researched guardianship laws and estate regulations until my eyes burned, trying to understand whether my parents could possibly have legitimate legal claims. According to everything I could find, their position seemed weak at best, but Jameson's concern suggested complications I hadn't anticipated. Around 3 a.m, I found myself in Catherine's study, searching through her meticulously organized files for any documentation related to my guardianship. In a locked drawer I had never been able to open before I discovered a folder labeled simply Richardson Family in Catherine's precise handwriting. Inside was a comprehensive history I had never known existed. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching my apprehensive mood as I prepared for what felt more like a battle than a family discussion. I dressed in the navy Armani suit Catherine had bought me for important business meetings, armor for whatever confrontation awaited. I arrived at Jameson's office 15 minutes early, carrying the contents of Catherine's secret file and my own weekend research. My parents were already there, accompanied by a thin man with slicked back hair, who introduced himself as Richard Hoffman, their attorney from Phoenix. "Just a precaution," my father explained with a tight smile. "Legal matters can become complicated quickly, and we want to make sure everyone's interests are protected." Jameson greeted them with professional courtesy, but without warmth. His assistant wheeled in a cart loaded with several boxes of files and documents, suggesting this would be a more comprehensive discussion than I had anticipated. "Before we begin," Jameson said, "I should clarify my role in these proceedings. I am the executor of Catherine Morrison's estate and have served as her personal attorney for 34 years. I also represent Madison's interests through specific provisions Catherine established." Hoffman leaned forward aggressively. "My clients are concerned about their daughter's sudden inheritance of such substantial assets. As her legal guardians, they have both the right and responsibility to ensure proper management of these resources." Jameson nodded thoughtfully. "That is precisely what I hoped to address today. there appears to be some fundamental misunderstanding about the legal status of all parties involved. He opened the first box and removed several official documents. Let me clarify the chronology as documented in court records and Catherine's private files. When Madison came into Catherine's care, he continued, temporary emergency guardianship was established through Colorado Family Court. Social services made extensive documented efforts to contact both parents regarding permanent arrangements. My mother frowned. We were dealing with serious personal issues and moving frequently. Communication was difficult. Indeed, Jameson agreed. After 8 months of failed contact attempts, the court scheduled a hearing regarding permanent guardianship transfer. Legal notices were sent to your last known addresses and published in appropriate legal publications. My father shifted uncomfortably. We never received any official notices. Interestingly, Jameson said, removing another document, someone did contact the court, claiming to represent your interests. A man named Marcus Kellerman appeared with signed affidavits, allegedly from both of you, consenting to permanent guardianship transfer to Catherine Morrison. My parents exchanged a glance that confirmed my growing suspicions. We never authorized anyone to represent us legally, my father protested. Those signatures must have been forged. Jameson adjusted his glasses. Catherine had similar concerns at the time. She hired a private investigator to locate you directly and confirm your intentions. He opened another box containing detailed reports with photographs. The investigator documented Mr. Richardson's presence at various casinos throughout Nevada and Arizona during this period. He also photographed Mrs. Richardson working at several establishments in Las Vegas. When the investigator approached you about Madison's situation, Jameson continued relentlessly. You both explicitly confirmed your desire to terminate parental responsibilities permanently. The color drained from my mother's face, while my father's jaw tightened visibly. Furthermore, Jameson said, removing additional documentation, the investigator recorded a payment of $25,000 from Marcus Kellerman to Mr. Richardson the day after those affidavits were signed. That was an unrelated business transaction, my father protested weakly. Jameson ignored the interruption. Catherine continued annual investigations to monitor your circumstances and evaluate whether contact might benefit Madison. I have reports spanning 15 years, documenting continued gambling activities, multiple evictions, employment terminations, and several encounters with collection agencies. He turned to another section of files. Particularly relevant are these documented attempts by Mrs. Richardson to contact Madison when she turned 18. He pushed a report toward me. 4 occasions when Mrs. Richardson called Catherine's home but disconnected before speaking. 2 emails sent to Madison's college account with incorrect addressing that were never delivered. I stared at this evidence of half-hearted contact attempts, feeling a complex mixture of pain and vindication. They had made minimal efforts that could ease their consciences without requiring actual commitment or risk. Most significantly, Jameson said, removing a sealed envelope, Catherine left specific instructions to be opened only in these exact circumstances. He handed me an envelope bearing my name in Catherine's distinctive handwriting. Perhaps you'd prefer to read this privately. I shook my head and broke the seal, unfolding several pages of familiar script. My dearest Madison. I read aloud, my voice, steadier than my emotions. If you are reading this, it means I have passed away, and your biological parents have reappeared, seeking financial benefit from your inheritance. My mother made a small sound of protest, but I continued reading. This is not coincidence or family intuition. Over the years, I have documented multiple instances where they attempted to extract money from me, using you as leverage. I looked up briefly to see my father staring at the floor with guilty intensity. 6 months after you came to live with me, Your father contacted me demanding $75,000 in exchange for not challenging the guardianship arrangement. I paid this extortion against my better judgment, fearing a custody battle would traumatize you further. The room fell completely silent, except for the sound of rain against the windows. 3 years later, he returned demanding additional money, claiming gambling debts had created dangerous situations. I refused and hired security for our home instead. I had to pause processing this revelation of threats I had never known about. When you turned 16, your mother called claiming she had been diagnosed with cancer and needed treatment funds. My investigator confirmed this was completely false. When you received your college acceptance, they somehow obtained your contact information and requested tuition assistance for what they termed a fresh start to rebuild our family relationship. I blocked these communications to protect you from their manipulation. Tears blurred my vision, but I forced myself to continue. I never shared these incidents because I wanted you to heal without additional betrayal. I hoped they would eventually seek genuine help and become the parents you deserved. That has not happened. I turned to the final page, my voice becoming stronger with each word. Now they will attempt to access your inheritance through guilt legal threats or emotional manipulation. Harold has all necessary documentation to protect you legally. The guardianship was converted to formal adoption when you were 17, though I maintained your original surname, hoping reconciliation might someday be possible. I had to stop completely absorbing this stunning revelation. Catherine had legally adopted me without ever mentioning it. You have been my daughter in every way that matters since then, and they have no legal claim to you or your inheritance. I carefully refolded the letter emotions, too complex for immediate processing. Jameson cleared his throat and removed additional documents from his files. I have the adoption papers here, he said, legally binding and properly executed through Georgia Family Court. I also have comprehensive documentation of the financial solicitations mentioned in Catherine's letter. He turned to address my stunned parents directly. Additionally, Catherine included a specific provision in her will stating that any legal challenge to these arrangements would result in the entire estate transferring immediately to a charitable foundation for abandoned children. There would be nothing remaining for anyone to claim. Their attorney, looking increasingly uncomfortable, leaned over to whisper urgently with my father. After a brief consultation, Hoffman cleared his throat. We had no knowledge of any adoption proceedings. My father said, his voice hollow. We were told this was temporary guardianship only. All legal communications are documented in these files. Jameson replied, patting a thick folder, including your signed consent forms and the subsequent adoption agreement. My father's face darkened with mounting anger. This is fraud. You manipulated the system and stole our daughter. I believe this office's security cameras are recording that outburst, Jameson noted calmly, which directly contradicts your previous statements about forgery and could constitute admission of accepting payment to transfer parental rights. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This isn't over. We have rights as biological parents. Actually, I said quietly, the word hanging in the charged air. I found Catherine's complete file last night. I know about the other families, too. His expression faltered noticeably. What other families? The Hendersons in Colorado. The Gallaghers in New Mexico. 4 other families you approached over the years, claiming to be relatives of recently deceased, wealthy individuals, apparently abandoning children and then attempting to profit from their inheritances has been your business model for quite some time. My mother began crying in earnest, her sobs echoing off the office walls. That's not true, Madison. We made terrible mistakes with you, but we would never save it. I interrupted, suddenly exhausted by their performance. Catherine documented everything. She even has recordings of your phone calls demanding money. My father's rage shifted to calculated bargaining mode. Listen, Madison, there's been a serious misunderstanding here. We can work this out as a family. No need for lawyers and accusations. I think we're finished, I said, standing with newfound resolve. Harold, is there anything else legally required today? No, he replied. The estate transfers to you completely. Your biological parents have no legal standing to challenge the will or the adoption. Then I'd like them to leave immediately. Madison, please, my mother begged, reaching toward me desperately. Just give us one chance to explain everything properly. 15 years, I said quietly. You had 15 years to explain. Instead, you waited until there was money involved. That tells me everything I need to know about your priorities. Jameson pressed his intercom button, and 2 security officers appeared at the door. These gentlemen will escort you out, he informed my parents. Any further contact with Madison should be directed through my office. You can't do this, my father shouted, his face reddening with fury. She's our daughter, regardless of any paperwork. No, I corrected him firmly. I was your daughter. Now I'm Catherine's. And she taught me to recognize the difference between genuine care and financial opportunism. As security escorted them toward the elevator, my mother turned back in final time. This isn't who we raised you to be, Madison. We gave you life. And Catherine gave me everything else, I replied, including protection from people who see relationships as transactions. After they had gone, I collapsed into my chair, emotional exhaustion washing over me like a tide. Jameson moved from behind his imposing desk to sit beside me, his formal demeanor softening into something more paternal. You should know, he said gently, that I'm also your godfather. Catherine asked me to accept that role when she adopted you, and I promised her I would continue looking after your interests indefinitely. This unexpected connection brought fresh tears, but they felt cleansing rather than painful. Why didn't she ever tell me about the adoption? I asked. She worried you might feel she was trying to replace your parents rather than simply protecting you legally, he explained. She wanted you to form your own opinions about family without feeling pressured by her choices. She influenced me more than anyone else ever has, I admitted, just by being consistently present when no one else was. Jameson nodded understandingly. We can file restraining orders if you wish. Given their documented history and financial motivations, a judge would almost certainly approve them. Yes, I decided without hesitation. I think that would be best for everyone. 1 year later, my life bears little resemblance to the uncertainty and pain that dominated the months following Catherine's death. I've settled completely into ownership of both the mansion and Morrison boutiques, making strategic changes that honor Catherine's legacy while expanding into digital markets she had been reluctant to embrace. The business has flourished under my leadership, with online sales increasing by 300% and 2 new physical locations opened in Charleston and Atlanta. Catherine's employees, who initially worried about working for someone so young, have embraced my management style as a natural evolution of her principles. My relationship with my biological parents ended completely after the restraining order was granted. According to Jameson, they returned to Phoenix after one unsuccessful attempt to contact local media with accusations about Catherine's business practices. The newspaper editor, a longtime friend of Catherine's, immediately called Jameson instead of running their story. The most meaningful development has been establishing the Catherine Morrison Foundation for Family Stability, using a portion of my inheritance to support children experiencing family disruption or abandonment. Through this work, I've met others with histories similar to mine, some who found healing through reconciliation, others who built chosen families from friends and mentors. Mrs. Thornton continues working at the mansion twice weekly, sharing stories about Catherine from before my arrival that paint a fuller picture of the woman who became my true mother. She was terrified when you first came, Mrs. Thornton confided recently. She'd never wanted children, never thought she had the temperament for motherhood. But she researched everything, spent hours reading about adolescent psychology and trauma recovery. These glimpses into Catherine's private concerns and efforts touch me deeply. She had accepted a responsibility she never sought, but fulfilled it with characteristic thoroughness and unwavering commitment. Jameson has become a regular fixture in my life, joining me for dinner monthly and offering guidance on both business and personal matters. As my godfather, he's embraced a more protective role than his previously formal relationship suggested. Catherine would be proud, he told me, recently, as we reviewed the Foundation's first annual report, not just of your business success, but of your resilience. She worried constantly that your early experiences would leave you bitter or unable to trust others. I've begun dating again, approaching relationships with clearer boundaries and expectations informed by Catherine's example. She taught me that love should be demonstrated through consistent actions, rather than merely declared in convenient moments. The most profound change has been internal. The question that haunted me for 15 years, why did they abandon me, no longer carries the same destructive power. I understand now that their departure reflected their limitations and failures, not my worth or value. More importantly, I recognize that Catherine's choice to stay, to commit, to show up every day for 15 years was the more significant decision. Family isn't defined by biology or legal documents, but by the thousands of small choices made daily about who deserves our time, energy, and care. Last month, I visited Catherine's grave with fresh gardenias, her favorite flowers. The headstone is elegant black marble with simple lettering exactly as she had specified. I had a small addition made after learning about the adoption, a single word, mother, engraved beneath her name, and dates. Standing there in the peaceful cemetery, I realized that Catherine had given me far more than financial security or business acumen. She had provided a model for living with dignity and purpose, demonstrating that chosen families can be stronger and more meaningful than biological connections. The inheritance she left me extended far beyond property and investments. She gave me the tools to recognize authentic relationships, the strength to set appropriate boundaries, and the wisdom to understand that love is not about what people say, but what they consistently do. I will never know whether my biological parents genuinely regret their choices or simply regret losing access to financial resources. In the end, their true motivations matter less than I once believed. What matters is the life I choose to build, the relationships I nurture, and the legacy I create moving forward. Sometimes the greatest betrayals lead to the most necessary discoveries about our own strength and the true meaning of family.